Hello everyone, Spicy Toast Gaming here. Hope you're having a great day so far, and I hope this video can make it a little bit better. Today we're doing a monthly challenge champion tier list, sort of. I think a normal tier list for the monthly challenges is not really the best approach to take because there's just so many different modifiers, so many different variables. Ranking all the champions in power against how they can do in a certain adventure, where there's much less variability, makes a lot more sense, but for the monthly challenges, I think it's better to take a much different approach. And so that's why this is sort of a monthly challenge tier list, but it's also a little bit different. The point of this video is actually to help you list and rank your own champions and prepare for the next set of monthly challenges. Monthly challenges are very different than every other content in the game. Monthly challenges, you only have a limited number of tries, and most of you are not going to have a completed account like me, and so I might recommend a champion that's very good, but for you, you might not have that champion unlocked, or they're too low level, don't have enough stars. And so that's why I recommend you use this same framework that we're going to describe here in a moment, and rank all of your own champions so that you're ready for the monthly challenges, and that you can clear them quickly and successfully. So up first for this tier list, we have the situational tier. Now, while every champion in the game is situationally good against different modifiers, these are going to be champions and builds that are specifically good against a specific modifier. And normally that modifier is pretty tough, and so these are champions you often want to be saving to deal with these modifiers. For this tier, I'll be showing you the champion, their build that I use to counter that modifier, and then the modifier itself. Now, there's not going to be that many in the situational tier because most modifiers in the game are pretty broad and you can actually use a lot of champions to deal with them. So after the situational tier, we have early, mid, and late. Now early, these are the champions you want to be using in the early part of the challenges. So the first challenges are generally easier, and this is where you want to use a lot of your slower decks or your champions that you just haven't leveled up very high, don't have that many star powers on them, and generally your weaker champions. Now some of the champions here might be very good against specific modifiers you might run into later, but in general, this is where you want to put your champions that you want to select for the early challenges. Now the early challenges are generally challenges 1 through 20. Next up then for the mid category, this is where you want to put a lot of your champions that are fairly strong and will be able to deal with most situations, essentially the champions that are going to be able to handle everything except the very toughest challenges. So normally these are the champions you're going to be selecting for roughly challenges 21 through to about 45 to 50. And then lastly, we have late. These are your most OP champions you have possible. These are the champions you want to pull out against the toughest challenges, which are normally the last 20 or so. Now, they will pepper in some tougher challenges throughout the run, but generally speaking, the last 20 is where the challenges get very difficult. So this is where you want to pull out your most broken, overpowered champions possible. Now at the very bottom, we have the bench. Now for me, since I have all of the champions, these are just the champions that I personally don't really want to play with. I have more than enough to complete all of the champions. So for me, generally just the ones I don't want to play with. But for you, this is probably where you're going to put the champions you don't have unlocked. They're too low level, you don't have starred up. Just an area for you to put all the champions you don't plan on using for these monthly challenges. Again, the point of this list is more just to organize all your champions, so while you're going through the challenges, you're just able to check your own personal tier list and know, okay, this is maybe a pretty easy challenge. Let's look in the early group of champions to see what champions best fits the modifier. I think a mistake many people make when doing the monthly challenges is always trying to find the champion that perfectly fits the modifier. That's normally not the case. Now against some of the more difficult challenges, you really need to try to take any advantage you can. But for most of the challenges, use the mutator if you can, but it's not that important. It's generally more important just to pick a solid champion and not necessarily worry about perfectly countering every single modifier. All right, now with all of that out of the way, let's start ranking some of these champions. Now again, for me, this is my personal setup going into the next set of monthly challenges. I am not trying to be overly objective here. I'm just ranking the champions how I see fit. And so if you disagree with me on a certain ranking, great, make that change for your own tier list as you prepare for this set of monthly challenges. Up first then, we have Aatrox. Now for Aatrox, I'm going to put him in the early category. He is a solid champion and will be able to dominate any of the early challenges. and should be able to bulldoze whatever you throw in front of him for those early challenges, because you're going to have more mana than the enemy opponent, and Aatrox really is a win more champion. While you're ahead, you absolutely dominate, and so he will feel absolutely amazing in those early challenges. Now, he can really struggle when you are behind, and so don't really want to use him for some of the mid or later challenges, but he'll be a lot of fun for those early ones. Next up then we have Annie, and we're putting her up in the situational category or tier. Now for Annie, I like to use her to counter any challenge that has the modifier of Chronicle of Ruin. So round start, kill all units, then revive it. As you see, I like throwing on a Luden's Tempest and then double chase guns. At the start of every round, Annie is going to die and then revive. When she revives, she's going to count as being summoned, fill in your hand back up with those chase guns, or actually warning shots, and you're going to use that to nuke down the enemy Nexus. Normally after just 2 to 3 rounds, the Nexus will be destroyed, and with the amount of CC and removal Annie brings, normally it's pretty easy to last those couple of rounds before the Nexus is actually destroyed. I used this build every single time I saw Chronicle of Ruin in the last set of monthly challenges, worked out incredibly well for me, and so I'm going to be saving this to do that again in this next set of monthly challenges. Next up then we have Ashe. I'm going to put her in the mid category, real solid champion, and can be great for countering some modifiers where you want a little bit of CC. She can be a bit of a slower deck, so against some of those tougher later challenges, you normally don't want to bring her out, but throughout the mid-range of challenges, she normally does pretty solid. Next up then we have Aurelion Sol. We all know where he's going to go. He's the most broken champion in the game, so he's going to go into the late category. Don't have him at 4 stars yet, but I will have him at 4 stars before the last set of challenges, and so he'll be able to absolutely dominate in those last couple challenges. Can't wait for it. Next up then we have Bard. Now Bard I'm throwing down in the bench. He is a solid champion. You'd probably want to have him in your early category if you have him leveled up, but he can often be a bit slow and there aren't that many modifiers that he really counters. And so since I have enough other champions that are just better, he is going down on the bench for me. Next up then we have Darius, and I'm throwing him in the mid category. He is a very solid champion, works well with a lot of different types of modifiers, especially ones that are buffing up your units, even if there's some sort of negative aspect to it, such as they can't block or they take damage at the end of the round. Darius is just great at rushing down the enemy and annihilating them in the first couple of rounds. That being said, he does have some weaknesses and doesn't have the most flexible of decks. If you don't win in the first couple rounds, you're probably going to end up losing. But for a lot of the more challenging challenges in the mid-tier, he is a great counter to them, but still not someone strong enough that you probably want to put in your late category. Also bear in mind that Darius loses a lot of power if you don't have him at 3 stars. So if you don't have him at 3 stars, you probably want to put him either in early or put him on your bench. If you have him maxed out though, he is an aggressive monster, and so he's going to be great for those mid-tier challenges. Next up then we have Diana, and I'm putting her up in the situational tier. Now Diana is specifically amazing for forest workout. All units have strike double my power. Now this is great if you have Diana at 3 stars with Gale Force. With your 3rd star power, Diana is able to get double attack, so each one of those counts as a strike, so each one is doubling your power. Then with that scout, you're able to again attack 2 times in a round. Each time you're attacking, you're double attacking. So essentially you're striking 4 times in a single round, and all of those strikes are doubling your power. Very important then to also try to increase your damage as much as possible with that Warhammer, and then also use the Troll King's Crown just to make sure you have that overwhelm. This is a great way to just one-shot the enemy Nexus anytime you see that forest workout modifier. Really solid champion though, if you don't want to use it for the forest workout, would be a contender for your mid or late tiers. Next up then we have Echo, and for me I'm going to again put him in the early category. Solid champion, great combo potential. There's a decent amount of modifiers that he can work well with, and he's going to be very good for a lot of those early challenges. Now, if you're someone that you main Echo and you really like playing them, then yes, I know many of you will probably put him in the mid or maybe even late categories. For me though, he's fun to play, but I don't really want to take him into some of those tougher challenges, so I'm just happy with using him for those early couple challenges. Next up then we have Elise, and I'm going to put her in the mid category. Very strong champion, can be very aggressive early and really rush down the enemy in the first couple rounds. Her biggest issue is that she is very champion reliant. If you don't draw her, your power drops dramatically, and you have to have her in your opening hand. I only lost one challenge in the last set of monthly challenges. That's because I took Elise into a match, wasn't able to draw her in the first couple rounds, and so I ended up losing, used my revive, tried again, still didn't draw her, and I lost that set of challenges. So really good, and is actually good enough that you could try to use them in some of those later challenges, but you might end up regretting it because of how champ reliant she really is. That's why I'm putting her in the mid tier. Next up then, we have Evelyn. And Evelyn, I'm actually going to put in the late category, which is probably going to surprise some of you after what I just said about Elise. Evelyn, though, absolutely amazing. Being able to run all the level up relics, that being Deceiver's Crest, Tempest Blade, and Crown Guard Inheritance, so that every time you level up, which Evelyn you can do essentially every single round, you stun the entire enemy board, rally, and you have a free removal spell. Incredibly strong, really good for dealing with even some of the toughest modifiers. The one issue is Evelyn is still champ reliant, but unlike Elise, you do have a couple rounds to try to draw her. You don't have to play her immediately first thing in the game. And also, unlike Elise, once you draw Evelyn, you're normally fine because you can then immediately start rallying, leveling up, and rushing down the enemy. Whereas Elise, you have to play her early and use your advantage early. If you draw her later in the game, it normally doesn't matter. By that point, you've actually lost already. Next up then, we have Garen, and I'm going to put him in the early category. Solid champion, great scaling, good removal, but there's just many other champions I'd rather use for those mid and late tier challenges. So for him, he'll be fun to stomp around in those early challenges. Next up then we have Gnar, and I'm also going to put him in the early category. Now for many of you, you're probably going to want to put Gnar on the bench, but if you have Gnar at 3 stars and maxed out like I do, he can be a great early game monster and will really be awesome for dominating all of those early challenges. And if you're really like Gnar and really good with him, you could probably actually move him up into the mid category, but I have enough other champions that I would prefer clearing those challenges on, so for me, he's just going to be having fun in those early challenges. Next up then we have Gwen, and I'm also going to put her in the mid category. Solid champion, great sustain, pretty consistent. However, against some of the later, tougher opponents, you can sometimes struggle with getting just rushed down too fast, and so for me, she's just a solid mid-tier champion. Next up then we have Alawi. Alawi, very similar to Gwen, and so also going to be a champion I want to deal with a lot of those mid-tier challenges. Again, similar to Gwen, very consistent, very strong mid-game win condition, normally attacking, leveling up with Crown Guard, being able to rally, and then immediately attack again, ending the game. And while she is quite solid, just not someone I really want to take into those last couple challenges. Next up we have Jack, and I'm also putting him in the mid category. Really good, especially once you have him at his 3 stars. Being able to just poke the entire enemy board is very strong, and he can end up countering many different enemies and modifiers. For me though, just not quite strong enough to go up against some of those later tier challenges. Next up then we have Janna, and I'm also putting her in the mid category. Now she's one that if you don't have her maxed out, she will feel pretty weak, so you probably want to put her in the early category or even put her on the bench for right now. Once you have her maxed out though, she can be very strong, can deal a lot of damage to the enemy nexus, and is very good for many of the modifiers in the monthly challenges. Many modifiers give you some cost reduction, and since her entire deck is built around cost reduction, once you get that cost reduction going, she can just spiral out of control and is very solid. Definitely a contender if you ever get the modifier of your first P and Z card costs 1 less to play, because that one guaranteed cost reduction just to start every single round is absolutely amazing for her. Next up then we have Jax, and I'm actually going to put him in the mid category. I know many of you are probably surprised by that, thinking that he would be in the late category for sure. He is a very strong champion and can deal with many different modifiers, and while he can rush down the enemy early, I feel like he's a little bit too weak for many of the late game challenges, especially because they have just too much mana and too much Nexus health for him to really contend with. If I didn't have a completed roster of every champion maxed out though, then he would probably be in my late tier, and one that if you have him maxed out, you probably also want to put him in your late tier. But for me, I just have too many other strong champions to put up there, and I would rather use Jax in the mid-tier challenges. Next up then we have Jhin, and I am also putting Jhin in the mid-tier. Great champion, tons of removal, tons of sustain, plenty of modifiers that he works well with or can try to help deal with, and again, is probably a champion that many of you are going to want to put in your late tier of champions, but for me, he's just a little bit too slow, and I have better champions to deal with those later challenges. Next up then we have Jinx. Obviously, going into the late category, definitely one of the strongest champions in the game, and is just able to put down so much damage onto the enemy units as well as Nexus, and is just one of the best champions for dealing with any challenge you throw in front of her, regardless of modifiers. Next up then, we have Kai'Sa, and I'm putting Kai'Sa on the bench. Kai'Sa has been nerfed several times, has just gotten weaker and weaker. Overall, a fine champion, but I just have so many better champions to deal with all the modifiers that for me, not really worth playing in most situations, so they're just going to sit on my bench. Next up then, we have Kayn, and I'm going to put Kayn in the early category. Again, similar to Aatrox, can be a bit of a win more champion. Once you're ahead, you absolutely dominate the game, but if you're not able to get ahead, you can really struggle. And so in general, I'm going to use him against the earlier challenges, although I will say there can be some modifiers that you might want to save him for, such as Formidable. But for me, I have a better answer for that I'll get into later. Next up then, we have Kindred, and I'm also going to put Kindred in the early category. Overall, a decent champion. However, for most of the modifiers that you would pick Kindred for, there's better champions that fulfill the same role. And so I often find a hard place to fit her in against some of the mid or later challenges, but she should do great against the early challenges. Next up then, we have LeBlanc. LeBlanc going in that late tier as well. One of the strongest champions in the game. Great flexibility in how you're actually going to build her. And another champion that, kind of regardless of what modifiers the challenge has, she'll probably be able to just dominate it and come away with the win. Next up then, we have Lee Sin. I personally just don't like Lee Sin, and so he's going on the bench. Now he can be good, especially against any modifiers that have Enlighten, so you start off with 10 spell mana, or not tell, that you start off with 10 mana, then you can put Chemtech Duplicator on him, give him Overwhelm, as well as maybe like a Hymn of Valor to double his stats. So there are some use cases where you can use him. In general though, I find his kit very clunky, don't really like playing with him, so for me, he's going on the bench. Next up then, we have Leona, and I'm putting her in the mid category. She has a great amount of CC as well as scaling, a lot of different modifiers you can use her on. However, it's just normally a bit too slow to deal with some of the later challenges. Up next then, we have Lux, and she's going in the mid category. Solid unit, can use a lot of the spell-based modifiers to her advantage, and is also a great champion that you can focus on relic builds that make your champion great, or you can go for a very passive setup with your relic builds and just focus on your deck and star powers. And she's a good focus of a spells-based deck, but also a unit-focused deck, and normally can rush down the enemy with rallies in that mid-game. Overall, very solid champion, but not one I really want to take against some of those late-tier challenges. Up next then, we have Master Yi, and I'm also going to put him in the mid category. Many spell-based modifiers work great with him, giving you some cost reduction, letting you go infinite with just playing your spells non-stop. And honestly, he just kind of has power crept Lee Sin for pretty much any situation that you could choose either one of them. Master Yi is just the better option and is normally able to close games in the second to third round. Next up then, we have Misfortune, and I'm putting her in the early category. Solid aggro deck with a fun swarm playstyle, really good for rushing through those early challenges, but can often get outscaled and not one you probably want to take in the mid or later challenges. Next up then, we have Nami, and I'm actually putting Nami in the late category. Now this is one that I went back and forth on many times, because I'll fully admit she's not as overpowered as some of the other champions in the late category, but I would still use her against some of those later challenges. Now, often in those later challenges, the enemy's going to rush you down very quickly. However, with Nami, you actually have a very large amount of sustain, so even though she might not be able to win as quickly or have as much control as some of the other champions in the same tier as her, she's able to really benefit from a lot of modifiers and can still be a solid pickup for some of those later challenges. Now, that being said, you need to probably pick her in the right situation. Some of the other champions in the same tier as her, you can pick them into essentially any modifiers and just absolutely dominate. With Nami, you probably actually want to make sure that the modifiers don't counter you and are actually ones that you can work around. But still, this category is 4 champions you want to pick for the last group of challenges, and Nami does fit that criteria for me. Next up then, we have Nasus, and for me, he's going on the bench. Now for many of you, probably be a solid early game champion, but for me, I just have so many better champions to play that it's not really worthwhile having him anywhere but the bench. Next up then, we have Nico, and I'm putting her in the mid tier. Now if you don't have Nico maxed out, you probably want to put her in early tier or potentially just have her on the bench. But once she's maxed out, she does get quite strong and can normally end games in the first couple rounds. Very solid champion, and one that, depending on your roster, you may actually even want to put in your late category. Now, she is very much being carried by the fact that she is a 2-cost champion, and so that gives her a large amount of power, but still a great addition to any roster. For me though, I do have stronger champions, so she's just sitting in the mid tier. Next up then we have Nidalee, and I'm putting her in the late category. One of the strongest champions in the entire game. You can play her round 1 and put out so much damage that you'll normally just flat out win. But against some of those later challenges, it might last a round or 2 longer. But that's not an issue because if you have Crown Guard Inheritance on her, you can very quickly rally even multiple times in the same round and just rush down the enemy and dominate, often regardless of whatever modifiers there are. In the last set of monthly challenges, whenever I came up to a really tough obstacle, Nidalee was always able to demolish it. Next up then, we have Neela, and she's going in the mid category. Fairly similar to Echo, really being carried by the fact that she is a 2-cost champion, but she does have some inherent card duplication from her star powers, and is overall a solid champion. That being said, not one that I really want to take into my later challenges, but depending on your roster, you may actually want to do that. Next up then, we have Ornn, and I'm putting him on the bench. Now for you, based on your roster, you may want to put Ornn in the situational tier. There are some modifiers that make it so you could play Ornn early, such as like Enlightened, where you start with 10 mana, or the one modifier where any cards you draw are set to 3. For me though, I have better cards to play in those situations, so even though I love him as a champion, he is down on the bench for me. Next up then we have Pyke, and I'm putting him in the early tier. Sadly, he has been hit pretty hard from recent nerfs as well as the relic changes, specifically Gatebreaker, but he is still a fun champion and will definitely be able to dominate those early challenges. Next up then we have Samira, and I'm putting her in the late category. She has been hit by the nerf bat many times, but I am continually impressed by her, and she was actually a champion that I pulled out in the last group of challenges, and she definitely was able to carry me through some of those. Now, similar to Nami, you potentially want to actually make sure the modifiers are going to work for you, and if you don't have her maxed out or you're not quite as confident in your Samira, you probably want to put her in the mid category. For me though, I like her a lot and I'm pretty good with her playstyle, so I'm confident having her in the late category. Next up then we have Set, and I'm actually putting him on the bench. Now he's one you might want to put in the situational tier. Again, if you have Enlightened, so you start with 10 mana, Set with Chemtech Duplicator is incredibly strong and can absolutely dominate in that situation. Otherwise, he's often too slow and I just have better champions to play. So if you have a smaller roster, you potentially are going to want to put him in either your early, mid, or situational tiers, but for me, he can just sit on the bench. Next up then we have Tahm Kench, and I'm going to put him in the situational tier. So I really like having him for the frenzied fighting. The player's units have 2/2, round end deal 2 damage to all the player's units, and I like going with the double Berserker's Buckle as well as the Troll King's Crown. This is able to give you a massive amount of scaling for your Tahm Kench as well as all of your units. And whenever I see frenzied fighting, which for the last set of monthly challenges was actually quite common, Tahm Kench is always a great pickup, and so while he is a solid champion in his own right, I normally save him specifically for that modifier. Next up we have Talia, and for me she is going down on the bench. Now she can be good when you specifically need to take out an enemy landmark. So if there's a modifier like Welcome to the Murder Bridge where you need to take out a landmark, she can be a decent option there. However, your landmark removal is generally 4 mana, and so the landmark's still going to activate for a couple rounds. Not necessarily a great counter to it, but can be decent. Overall, though, I just have too many better champions, and so for me, she's just going to ride the bench. Next up, then, we have the Poro King. Now, for me, the Poro King is going to be a early champion. He can often be a little bit too slow or inconsistent for me to want to bring him into mid or later tier challenges. And to be honest, quite often I was saving him for situational cases, and the different situations that I tried him in normally didn't work out well. So for one, I tried to use him against small stuff, which while I was able to win was very, very painful and I don't recommend it. And then also I tried to use him into the modifier that I used Annie for, which round end, kill all your units, then revive them. I thought that would help trigger some of his star powers that revolve on your units dying, but that didn't actually work out. And so for the next set of monthlies, I'm probably just going to use him early, but I'm still on the lookout for the right set of modifiers to really work well with him. If you have any suggestions, definitely let me know down below, but for right now, he's just going to be sitting in the early tier. Next up, we have Thresh, and I'm going to put him in the situational tier. So he's great with the dying laughing. Game start, all players summon a 0/10 Phantom Prankster. That's the unit when one of your units dies, you deal 1 damage to the enemy nexus. Now Thresh is specifically good with this relic setup I have right here, all about killing your own units, and whenever your own units die, you're summoning those husks. The epic item really makes Thresh much stronger, and while he's good for this modifier, there's actually many modifiers that he works quite well for, just whenever you have one that involves your units dying. And so if you happen to have a Thresh maxed out, and especially if you have this relic, he's a great addition to your roster, especially for this modifier, but actually for many different modifiers. Likely though, you don't have your Thresh leveled up, you didn't invest any stars in him, or you don't have this epic relic. If that's the case, he's probably going to be riding your bench. Alright, next up we have Varus, and he's going in the mid tier. Solid champion, a lot of different spell-based modifiers he is decent for, but not one that I really want to take into the later challenges, so he's going to sit in the mid-tier for me. Next up then we have Vayne, and I'm also putting her in the mid-tier. Solid champion, especially when you can get some of the modifiers, especially with the one where your first Demacian card costs 1 less every round. That lets you play Vayne round 1. And overall, it's just a solid champion into many of the different challenges, but again, not one that I want to take into any of the later challenges. She's not that strong. Next up then we have Vhagar, and I'm putting him in the situational tier. So he is specifically amazing into formidable, especially with this build you're seeing. The formidable modifier, if you're not sure, makes it so that units use their health to deal damage instead of their power. And so Vhagar, the fact that you're making free removal every single round, you can use that so that even if you don't kill an enemy target, you're still reducing down their effective damage. And with that Chemtech duplicator, you normally can end the game right when you hit that 6 mana. And then with all your removal as well as CC that you have built into your kit, it's normally not too much of a difficulty getting to that 6 mana. So anytime I see the formidable modifier, I pull out my Vhagar and absolutely dominate. Next up then we have Vi, and I'm going to throw Vi in the early category. Very fun and stompy champion that you'll be able to dominate in those early challenges, but one that I'd rather choose other champions for the mid or later challenges. Next up then we have Volibear, and I'm putting him in the mid tier. So very strong champion, and one that many of you might actually want to put in your late tier. He can end games surprisingly quickly, and Volibear himself is just a amazing win condition, and he can specifically go great when you have either Enlightened, so you start with 10 mana so you can play him round 1, or with the power that cards you draw cost 3, because if you can play him for 3 mana, again, absolutely amazing, really solid champion, but one that for me, I have better options for some of those tougher challenges for later on in the monthly challenges. Next up then we have Yasuo, and I'm actually putting Yasuo in the late tier. So with his hard CC being stun, he is great at dealing with some of the tougher challenges in the game, because normally just stunning the enemy's toughest units will really keep them from ending the game. And so you can hold out long enough for your Yasuo to scale up and end you the game. Now he plays very different than most of the other champions I have in my late tier, but I find that he's a very solid champion that can deal with even the toughest challenges. Last up then we have Yuumi. And Yuumi is one that I'm putting in the situational tier. Now, to be honest, I've never actually played Yuumi into small stuff, but from what I've been hearing from everyone, I hear she absolutely counters it. Since you're not technically playing her, you are attaching her to another unit, and so it makes sense that she's going to counter this modifier. This is one of the hardest modifiers in the game and is really a pain to deal with. And I also have a really good setup with Yuumi. That epic relic gives you free cost reduction without any downsides. I also have Gale Force, which makes Yuumi very powerful, and then I actually go with a stat relic. Now I count on the poros you get at the start of the game, either rolling with Overwhelm or Elusive, which is a bit of a risk. You might want to switch that Warhammer out for Overwhelm potentially, or a different keyword relic, but for me, I'm going to be saving Yuumi with this build for small stuff. Now if you have your Yuumi maxed out, and especially if you have her with Gale Force, you might actually want to use her for some of the mid or later tier fights if for some reason there's not much small stuff in the next set of monthly challenges, or if you want to try using someone else into small stuff. She is actually a very solid early game champion. For me, me though, going forward, I plan on holding on to her for any small stuff that's gonna pop up. All right, that's it for this monthly tier list. Sort of. Again, this is more about how you want to think about your champions and just a system you probably want to use to try to organize your champions before the next set of monthly challenges and for monthly challenges going forward. And like I said at the beginning, I wasn't trying to be overly objective. I was more just showing you how I am preparing for the next set of monthly challenges, how I am organizing my champions, and how this is something I recommend you doing as well if you're wanting to prepare for the next set of challenges. Now, these lists are going to be specific to you and your roster because for the most part, everyone's roster is different. There's going to be champions that you're very strong with that other people maybe don't like as much, or there's going to be champions that other people really suggest that they're very strong with, but maybe you don't like playing them, or you don't have them at a high enough level or star power. So I really recommend you organize your champions in a similar way. You don't have to follow this exactly if there's a better way that's gonna make more sense to you. But I think it's a great idea to organize your champions before the monthly challenges so that when the monthlies actually happen, you don't have to spend a couple minutes scrambling through your whole roster of champions trying to find this perfect champion to counter these challenges. Not having to go to Reddit and post who do I need for these specific challenges. Now, it still might happen against some of the toughest challenges, but I think planning out and organizing your roster beforehand can really help you. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, definitely like and subscribe, and I hope you all have a great day and good luck on the next set of monthly challenges.